Excellency Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister of the State of Israel.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, I didn't intend to come here this year. My country is at war, fighting for its life. But after I heard the lies and slanders leveled at my country by many of the speakers at this podium, I decided to come here and set the record straight. I decided to come here to speak for my people, to speak for my country, to speak for the truth. And here's the truth. Israel seeks peace. Israel yearns for peace. Israel has made peace and will make peace again. Yet we face savage enemies who seek our annihilation, and we must defend ourselves against these savage murderers. Our enemies seek not only to destroy us, they seek to destroy our common civilization and return all of us to a dark age of tyranny and terror. When I spoke here last year, I said we faced the same timeless choice that Moses put before the people of Israel thousands of years ago. As we were about to enter the Promised Land, Moses told us that our actions will determine whether we bequeath to future generations a blessing or a curse. And that is the choice we face today. The curse of Iran's unremitting aggression, or the blessing of a historic reconciliation between Arab and Jew. In the days that followed that speech, the blessing I spoke of came into sharper focus. A normalization deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel seemed closer than ever. But then came the curse of October 7th. Thousands of Iranian-backed Hamas terrorists from Gaza burst into Israel in pickup trucks, on motorcycles, and they committed unimaginable atrocities. They savagely murdered 1,200 people. They raped and mutilated women. They beheaded men. They burned babies alive. They burnt entire families alive, babies, children, parents, grandparents, in scenes reminiscent of the Nazi Holocaust. Hamas kidnapped 251 people from dozens of different countries, dragging them into the dungeons of Gaza. Israel has brought home 154 of these hostages, including 117 who returned alive. I want to assure you, we will not rest until the remaining hostages are brought home too. And some of their family members are here with us today. I ask you to stand up. With us is Eli Stevie, whose son Idan was abducted from the Nova Music Festival. That was his crime, a music festival. And these murderous monsters took him. Kobe Smirno, whose son Jonathan was murdered, and his corpse was taken into the dungeons, into the terror tunnels of Gaza. A corpse held hostage. Salim al-Atrash, whose brother Muhammad, a brave Arab-Israeli soldier, was murdered. His body too was taken to Gaza. And so was the body of Ifat Hyman's daughter in Bar, who was brutally murdered at that same music festival. With us is Sharon Sharabi, whose brother Yossi was murdered, and who prays for his older brother Eli, who is still held hostage in Gaza. And with us too is Izhar Lifsich, from kibbutz Nir Oz, a kibbutz that was wiped out by the terrorists. Thankfully, we achieved the release of his mother Yocheved, but his father Oded is still languishing in an underground terrorist hell of Hamas. I again promise you, we will return your loved ones home. We will not spare that effort until this holy mission is accomplished. Ladies and gentlemen, the curse of October 7th began when Hamas invaded Israel from Gaza, but it didn't end there. Israel was soon forced to defend itself on 6 more war fronts organized by Iran. On October 8th, Hezbollah attacked us from Lebanon. Since then, they fired over 8,000 rockets at our towns and cities, at our civilians, at our children. 2 weeks later, the Iran-backed Houthis in Yemen launched drones and missiles at Israel, the first of 250 such attacks, including one yesterday aimed at Tel Aviv. Iran's Shiite militias in Syria and Iraq have targeted Israel dozens of times over the past year as well. Fueled by Iran, Palestinian terrorists in Judea and Samaria perpetrated scores of attacks there and throughout Israel. And last April, for the first time ever, Iran directly attacked Israel from its own territory, firing 300 drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles at us. I have a message for the tyrants of Tehran. If you strike us, we will strike you. There is no place in Iran that the long arm of Israel cannot reach, and that's true of the entire Middle East. Far from being lambs led to the slaughter, Israel's soldiers have fought back with incredible courage and with heroic sacrifice. And I have another message for this assembly and for the world outside this hall. We are winning. Ladies and gentlemen, as Israel defends itself against Iran in the seven-front war, the line separating the blessing and the curse could not be more clear. This is the map I presented here last year. It's a map of a blessing. It shows Israel and its Arab partners forming a land bridge connecting Asia and Europe between the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea. Across this bridge, we will lay rail lines, energy pipelines, fiber optic cables, and this will serve the betterment of 2 billion people. Now look at this second map. It's a map. Look at the second map. It's a map of a curse. It's a map of an arc of terror that Iran has created and imposed from the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean. Iran's malignant arc has shut down international waterways. It cuts off trade. It destroys millions, destroys nations from within, and inflicts misery on millions. On the one hand, a bright blessing, a future of hope. On the other hand, a dark future of despair. And if you think this dark map is only a curse for Israel, if you think that, then you should think again. Because Iran's aggression, if it's not checked, will endanger every single country in the Middle East and many, many countries in the rest of the world. Because Iran seeks to impose its radicalism well beyond the Middle East. That's why it funds terror networks on 5 continents. That's why it builds ballistic missiles for nuclear warheads to threaten the entire world. For too long, the world has appeased Iran. It turns a blind eye to its internal repression. It turns a blind eye to its external aggression. Well, that appeasement must end, and that appeasement must end now. Nations of the world should support the brave people of Iran who want to rid themselves of this evil regime. Responsible governments should not only support Israel in rolling back Iran's aggression, they should join Israel. They should join Israel in stopping Iran's nuclear weapons program. In this body, in the Security Council, we're going to have a deliberation in a few months. And I call on the Security Council to snap back UN Security Council sanctions against Iran, because we must all do everything in our power to ensure that Iran never gets nuclear weapons. For decades, I've been warning the world against Iran's nuclear program. Our actions delayed this program by perhaps a decade, but we haven't stopped it. We've delayed it, but we haven't stopped it. Iran now seeks to weaponize its nuclear program for the sake of the peace and security of all your countries. For the sake of the peace and security of the entire world, we must not let that happen. And I assure you, Israel will do everything in its power to make sure it doesn't happen. So, ladies and gentlemen, the question before us is simple. Which of these two maps that I showed you will shape our future? Will it be the blessings of peace and prosperity for Israel, our Arab partners, and the rest of the world? Or will it be the curse in which Iran and its proxies spread carnage and chaos everywhere? Israel has already made its choice. We've decided to advance the blessing. We're building a partnership for peace with our Arab neighbors while fighting the forces of terror that threaten that peace. For nearly a year, the brave men and women of the IDF have been systematically crushing Hamas's terror army that once ruled Gaza. On October 7th, the day of that invasion into Israel, that terror army numbered nearly 40,000 terrorists. It was armed with more than 15,000 rockets. It had 350 miles of terror tunnels, an underground network bigger than the New York subway system, which they used to wreak havoc above and below ground. A year later, the IDF has killed or captured more than half of these terrorists, destroyed over 90% of their rocket arsenal, and eliminated the key segments of their terror tunnel network. In major military operations, we destroyed nearly all of Hamas's terror battalions, 23 out of 24 battalions. Now, to complete our victory, we are focused on mopping up Hamas's remaining fighting capabilities. We are taking out senior terrorist commanders and destroying remaining terrorist infrastructure. But all the while, and I'll say this one more time, we remain focused on our sacred mission, bringing our hostages home, and we will not stop until that mission is complete. Now, ladies and gentlemen, even with Hamas's greatly diminished military capability, the terrorists still exercise some governing power in Gaza by stealing the food that we enable aid agencies to bring into Gaza. Hamas steals the food, and then they hike the prices. They feed their bellies, and then they fill their coffers with money that they extort from their own people. They sell the stolen food at exorbitant prices, and that's how they stay in power. Well, this too has to end, and we're working to bring it to an end. And the reason is simple. Because if Hamas stays in power, it will regroup, rearm, and attack Israel again and again and again, as it is vowed to do. So Hamas has got to go. Just imagine, for those who say, well, Hamas has to stay, it has to be part of a post-war Gaza. Imagine, in a post-war situation in World War II, imagine allowing the defeated Nazis in 1945 to rebuild Germany. It's inconceivable. It's ridiculous. It didn't happen then. It's not going to happen now. This is why Israel will reject any role for Hamas in a post-war Gaza. We don't seek to resettle Gaza. What we seek is a demilitarized and de-radicalized Gaza. Only then can we ensure that this round of fighting will be the last round of fighting. We are ready to work with regional and other partners to support a local civilian administration in Gaza committed to peaceful coexistence. As for the hostages, I have a message for the Hamas captors. Let them go. Let them go. All of them. Those alive today must be returned alive, and the remains of those whom you brutally killed must be returned to their families. Those families here with us today, and others in Israel, deserve to have a resting place for their loved ones, a place where they can grieve and remember them. This war, ladies and gentlemen, this war can come to an end now. All that has to happen is for Hamas to surrender, lay down its arms, and release all the hostages. But if they don't, we will fight until we achieve victory, total victory. There is no substitute for it. Israel must also defeat Hezbollah in Lebanon. Hezbollah is the quintessential terror organization in the world today. It has tentacles that span in all continents. It has murdered more Americans and more Frenchmen than any group except bin Laden. It's murdered the citizens of many countries represented in this room. And it has attacked Israel viciously over the last 20 years, in the last year, completely unprovoked. A day after the Hamas massacre, on October 7th, Hezbollah began attacks against Israel, which forced more than 60,000 Israelis on our northern border to leave their homes, becoming refugees in their own land. Hezbollah turned vibrant towns in the north of Israel into ghost towns. So I want you to think about this in equivalent American terms. Just imagine if terrorists turned El Paso and San Diego into ghost towns. Then ask yourself, how long would the American government tolerate that? A day? A week? A month? I doubt they tolerate it even for a single day. Yet Israel has been tolerating this intolerable situation for nearly a year. Well, I've come here today to say, enough is enough. We won't rest until our citizens can return safely to their homes. We will not accept a terror army perched on our northern border, able to perpetrate another October 7th style massacre. For 18 years, Hezbollah brazenly refused to implement UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which requires it to move its forces away from our borders. Instead, Hezbollah moved right up to our border. They secretly dug terror tunnels to infiltrate our communities and indiscriminately fired thousands of rockets into our towns and villages. They fire these rockets and missiles not from military sites, not from that. They do that too. But they fire those rockets and missiles after they place them in schools, in hospitals, in apartment buildings, and in the private homes of the citizens of Lebanon. They endanger their own people. They put a missile in every kitchen, a rocket in every garage. I said to the people of Lebanon this week, get out of the death trap that Hezbollah has put you in. Don't let Nasrallah drag Lebanon into the abyss. We're not at war with you. We're at war with Hezbollah, which has hijacked your country and threatens to destroy ours. As long as Hezbollah chooses the path of war, Israel has no choice, and Israel has every right to remove this threat and return our citizens to their homes safely. And that's exactly what we're doing. Just this week, the IDF destroyed large percentages of Hezbollah's rockets, which had built with Iran's funding for 3 decades. We took out senior military commanders who not only shed Israeli blood, but American and French blood as well. And then we took out their replacements, and then the replacements of their replacements. And we'll continue degrading Hezbollah until all our objectives are met. Ladies and gentlemen, we're committed to removing the curse of terrorism that threatens all civilized societies. But to truly realize the blessing of a new Middle East, we must continue the path we paved with the Abraham Accords 4 years ago. Above all, this means achieving a historic peace agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And having seen the blessings that we've already brought with the Abraham Accords, the millions of Israelis who've already flown back and forth across the Arabian Peninsula, over the skies of Saudi Arabia, to the Gulf countries, the trade, the tourism, the joint ventures, the peace, I say to you, what blessings such a peace with Saudi Arabia would bring. It would be a boon to the security and economy of our two countries. It would boost trade and tourism across the region. It would help transform the Middle East into a global juggernaut. Our two countries could cooperate on energy, water, agriculture, artificial intelligence, and many, many other fields. Such a peace, I'm sure, would be a true pivot of history. It would usher in a historic reconciliation between the Arab world and Israel, between Islam and Judaism, between Mecca and Jerusalem. While Israel is committed to achieving such a peace, Iran and its terror proxies are committed to scuttling it. That's why one of the best ways to foil Iran's nefarious designs is to achieve the peace. Such a peace would be the foundation for an even broader Abrahamic alliance. And that alliance would include the United States, Israel's current Arab peace partners, Saudi Arabia, and others who choose the blessing of peace. It would advance security and prosperity across the Middle East and bring enormous benefits to the rest of the world. With American support and leadership, I believe this vision can materialize, and much sooner than people think. And as the Prime Minister of Israel, I will do everything in my power to make it happen. This is an opportunity that we and the world should not let go by. Ladies and gentlemen, Israel has made its choice. We seek to move forward to a bright age of prosperity and peace. Iran and its proxies have also made their choice. They want to move back to a dark age of terror and war. And now I have a question. And I pose that question to you. What choice will you make? Will your nation stand with Israel? Will you stand with democracy and peace? Or will you stand with Iran, a brutal dictatorship that subjugates its own people, exports terrorism across the globe? In this battle between good and evil, there must be no equivocation. When you stand with Israel, You stand for your own values and your own interests. Yes, we're defending ourselves, but we're also defending you against a common enemy that through violence and terror seeks to destroy our way of life. So there should be no confusion about this. But unfortunately, there is a lot of it in many countries and in this very hall, as I've just heard. Good is portrayed as evil, and evil is portrayed as good. We see this moral confusion when Israel is falsely accused of genocide, when we defend ourselves against enemies who try to commit genocide against us. We see this too when Israel is absurdly accused by the ICC prosecutor of deliberately starving Palestinians in Gaza. What an absurdity. We helped bring in 700,000 tons of food into Gaza. That's more than 3,000 calories a day for every man, woman, and child in Gaza. We see this moral confusion when Israel is falsely accused of deliberately targeting civilians. We don't want to see a single person, a single innocent person die. That's always a tragedy. And that's why we do so much to minimize civilian casualties, even as our enemies use civilians as human shields. And no army has done what Israel is doing to minimize civilian casualties. We drop flyers, we send text messages, we make phone calls by the millions to ensure that Palestinian civilians get out of harm's way. We spare no effort in this noble pursuit. We see yet another profound moral confusion when self-described progressives march against the democracy of Israel. Don't they realize they support the Iranian-backed goons in Tehran and in Gaza? The goons who gun down protesters, murder women for not covering their hair, and hang gays in public squares, some progressives. According to the U.S. Director of National Intelligence, Iran funds and fuels many of the protesters against Israel. Who knows, maybe some of the protesters, or even many of the protesters outside this building now. Ladies and gentlemen, King Solomon, who reigned in our eternal capital, Jerusalem, 3,000 years ago, proclaimed something that is familiar to all of you. He said, "There is nothing new under the sun." Well, in an age of space travel, quantum physics, and artificial intelligence, some would argue that's a debatable statement. But one thing is undeniable. There is definitely nothing new at the United Nations. Take it from me. I first spoke from this podium as Israel's ambassador to the UN in 1984. That's exactly 40 years ago. And in my maiden speech here, I think it's the same podium, by the way. In my maiden speech here, I spoke against a proposal to expel Israel from this body. 4 decades later, I find myself defending Israel against that same preposterous proposal. And who's leading the charge this time? Not Hamas, but Abbas, Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas. This is the man who claims he wants peace with Israel. Yet he still refuses to condemn the horrific massacre of October 7th. He's still paying hundreds of millions to terrorists who murder Israelis and Americans. It's called pay for slay. The more you murder, the more you get paid. And he still wages unremitting diplomatic warfare against Israel's right to exist and against Israel's right to defend itself. And by the way, they amount to the same thing. Because if you can't defend yourself, you can't exist. Not in our neighborhood, certainly, and maybe not in yours. Standing in this podium 40 years ago, I told the sponsors of that outrageous resolution to expel Israel, "Gentlemen, check your fanaticism at the door." Today, I tell President Abbas and all of you who would shamefully support that resolution, check your fanaticism at the door. The singling out of the one and only Jewish state continues to be a moral stain on the United Nations. It has made this once respected institution contemptible in the eyes of decent people everywhere. But for the Palestinians, this UN House of Darkness is home court. They know that in this swamp of anti-Semitic bile, there's an automatic majority willing to demonize the Jewish state on anything. In this anti-Israel flat earth society, any false charge, any outlandish allegation can muster a majority. In the last decade, there have been more resolutions passed against Israel in this hall at the UN General Assembly than against the entire world combined. Actually, more than twice as many. Since 2014, this body condemned Israel 174 times. It condemned all the other countries in the world 73 times. That's more than 100 extra condemnations for the Jewish state. What hypocrisy, what a double standard, what a joke. So the UN's hostility So all the speeches you heard today, all the hostility directed at Israel this year, it's not about Gaza. It's about Israel. It's always been about Israel's very existence. And I say to you, until the Jewish state is treated like other nations, until this anti-Semitic swamp is drained, the UN will be viewed by fair-minded people everywhere as nothing more than a contemptuous farce. Now, given the anti-Semitism at the UN, it should surprise no one that the prosecutor at the ICC, one of the UN's affiliated organs, is considering issuing arrest warrants against me and Israel's defense minister, the democratically elected leaders of the democratic state of Israel. The ICC prosecutors rushed to judgment. His refusal to treat Israel with its independent courts, the way other democracies are treated, is hard to explain by anything other than pure anti-Semitism. Ladies and gentlemen, the real war criminals are not in Israel. They're in Iran. They're in Gaza, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen. Those of you who stand with these war criminals, those of you who stand with evil against good, with a curse against the blessing, those of you who do so should be ashamed of yourselves. But I have a message for you. Israel will win this battle. We'll win this battle because we don't have a choice. After generations in which our people were slaughtered, remorselessly butchered, and no one raised a finger in our defense, we now have a state. We now have a brave army, an army of incomparable courage, and we are defending ourselves. As the book of Samuel says in the Bible, Netzach Yisrael lo yishaker. The eternity of Israel will not falter. In the Jewish people's epic journey from antiquity, in our odyssey through the tempest and upheavals of modern times, that ancient promise has always been kept, and it will hold true for all time. To borrow a great poet's phrase, Israel will not go gently into that good night. We will never need to rage against the dying of the light, because the torch of Israel will forever shine bright. To the people of Israel and to the soldiers of Israel, I say, be strong and of good courage. חזקו ואמצו ואל תיראו מפניהם, כי אדוני אלוהיך הוא ההולך עמך, לא ירפך ולא יעזבך. Am Yisrael Chai, the people of Israel live now, tomorrow, forever. Thank you.
as our global community finds itself at an inflection point which will determine the fate of future generations. Our planet really should have been in better shape in the year 2024. But instead, we are deeply disturbed and dismayed by fresh divisions, the flouting of international law, gross violations of human rights, and the flourishing of illegal settlements and oppression, which threaten peace and security around the world. Further, the alarm bells on the climate crisis have long been sounded, and yet we race toward a point of no return. The dream of ending persistent inequality remains a challenge to the global community, and hard-earned progress on gender equality appears to have stagnated in some parts of the world. It is for these reasons, Mr. President, that Trinidad and Tobago welcomed the convening of the Summit of the Future and joined with the international community in the adoption of the Pact for the Future. The adoption of this pact represents a renewal of our commitment as member states to multilateralism as the best way forward. Mr. President, since the dawn of civilization, humankind has endeavored to become an improved version of itself in the pursuit of a better quality of life, human rights, equality, dignity, and prosperity. Our ingenuity as human beings has paved the way for some of the world's greatest inventions and advancements. Regrettably, in our quest to find the best version of ourselves, we have discovered some of the worst aspects of humanity. Our planet and its people have been subjected to misuse and abuse, the effects of which have placed the majority of the global population facing some version of a doomsday scenario. Now more than ever, we must summon a spirit of cooperation and collectively put our shoulders to the wheel for the benefit of all humanity. We used to say that our future depends on it, but now we have to say that our existence depends on it. It is very well established and accepted that there can be no sustainable development without peace. If we fail to find credible solutions to the global challenges, humanitarian crises, and conflicts around the world, the international community would have squandered its responsibility and would have perpetuated a vicious downward cycle of repression. One example is the Russia-Ukraine war, which is still ongoing almost 3 years after Russia's initial invasion, which we condemned, with profound implications to the world order. Mr. President, Trinidad and Tobago is deeply troubled by the escalation of conflict and tensions in the Middle East. We remain distressed by the ongoing war on Gaza and by the chilling flashpoints of expansion that are being deployed on a daily basis. Only someone absolutely bereft of humanity would think that it is lawful and just and even godly to respond to atrocities committed on one awful day of terror by in turn committing atrocities after atrocities. How else are we to describe the killing of over 200 UN staff members, the highest death toll in United Nations history, and the deaths of tens of thousands of civilians, including women and children? And this is not being done in secret. The entire world is watching, and the Global South in particular is appalled. The question remains, if innocent civilians, including women, children, and United Nations staff, were being killed at this record rate in the developed world, how would the world's big powers have reacted? Not likely with euphemisms and platitudes. The double standards and continued resourcing of these ongoing violations of international law send a chilling message to the Global South. And that message is this: there are some powerful people in this world who are of the view that a Palestinian child is less worthy of defense, protection, food, water, and life than another child. I am not of that view. The people of my country are not of that view. CARICOM is not of that view. And decent people all over the world, including in Israel, are not of that view. International law is not a tool of mere convenience to be muted for friends and trumpeted against enemies. Mr. President, international law is not a tool of mere convenience to be muted for our friends and trumpeted against our enemies. In this regard, Trinidad and Tobago has joined the call for an immediate, full, and complete ceasefire, and for the unconditional release of every single hostage. The truth is, there is no military solution to this conflict, as peace will only be achieved through negotiations in good faith and constructive dialogue among all concerned parties. Trinidad and Tobago has consistently expressed our support for a two-state solution where Israelis can live without the daily threat of terror and Palestinians can live without the daily weight of occupation, coexisting side by side as responsible members of the international community. We firmly believe that this is the only credible pathway to end this cycle of violence, culminating in the establishment of a sovereign and peaceful state of Palestine alongside a sovereign and peaceful state of Israel within secure borders. Rooted in this belief, Trinidad and Tobago took the decision to recognize the state of Palestine in our contribution to the two-state solution and in support of the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian people for self-determination. I can report that just 6 days ago, Trinidad and Tobago and the State of Palestine officially established diplomatic relations. We look forward to the day when the State of Palestine would be welcomed to take its seat in the General Assembly as a full member of the United Nations. Mr. President, I now turn to the issue affecting the International Criminal Court. Despite its detractors, the evidence before us clearly shows the value and effectiveness and necessity of the International Criminal Court. As a country that advocated for the establishment of the ICC via the tireless work of our former Prime Minister and President, A.N.R. Robinson, Trinidad and Tobago remains resolute in our support of the court's mandate to help put an end to impunity for the perpetrators of the most heinous crimes and to provide a glimmer of hope to all victims of those crimes seeking justice within the jurisdiction of the court. To this end, we continue to encourage all states that have not yet done so to ratify and fully implement the Rome Statute of the ICC. It was the late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. who once said, "It is not possible to be in favor of justice for some people and not be in favor of justice for all people." For this reason, Mr. President, Trinidad and Tobago condemns, rejects, and repudiates any and all attempts to impede, intimidate, or improperly influence the court and its very courageous officials. Mr. President, we are mindful that the illicit trafficking in small arms and light weapons in our own region poses an intolerable threat to national security and to the lives of our citizens. The proliferation of illegal arms and ammunition has contributed to unacceptable increases in the level of gun-related violence and fatalities in our small society and indeed across CARICOM. In addition to our own efforts domestically, we continue to work with regional and international partners to free our citizens from the horrific human cost associated with the easy access to small arms and light weapons and their vicious use against citizens and families. Following the hosting by Trinidad and Tobago of our first regional symposium on crime and violence as a public health safety issue in 2023, CARICOM heads met in Guyana earlier this year to further elaborate innovative strategies on this matter of grave regional concern. Trinidad and Tobago welcomes the renewed efforts of our partners, including the United States of America in particular, to work with us constructively to help solve this deadly challenge which respects no borders. Mr. President, we also remain deeply concerned by the humanitarian and security crisis affecting the nation of Haiti. Earlier this year, from this very rostrum, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, chairman of the CARICOM Reparations Commission, stated, and I quote, "We are calling for justice for the people of Haiti, who should have been held aloft for being the first nation to end the evil of slavery. They should have been held aloft for being the most noble exemplars of freedom and the celebration of democratic possibilities in Western modernity. Instead, for their audacity of action, they were punished by the Western world and demonized rather than deified. End quote. We acknowledge that the path toward a stable and secure Haiti requires indigenous, Haitian-led, Haitian-owned solutions that are ably supported by the United Nations and the international community. In this regard, we welcome the news of the appointment of an interim Prime Minister and cabinet. We believe that these are important steps in confronting the political, security, and humanitarian challenges in Haiti. And I salute the role of CARICOM, its hard-working secretariat, and the eminent persons group in helping the Haitians to achieve some of this progress for themselves. Trinidad and Tobago also joins in commending the Kenyan government for its deployment and leadership of the multinational security support mission, and we extend our appreciation to all states that have contributed to that operation, including Jamaica, the Bahamas, and several others in our region. But an essential component for the success of this multinational security support mission is funding. In this regard, the government of the United States of America has led by example and has contributed the lion's share. And Canada has stepped up as well. But some relatively wealthy countries have either contributed drips and drabs or nothing at all. We appeal to the international community to contribute the necessary funding to support this crucially important venture. Mr. President, our quest to achieve human dignity within the context of sustainable development cannot be divorced from the legitimate calls for reparatory justice for the history of chattel slavery and native genocide in the Caribbean and elsewhere. The brutality of our colonial experience, the trauma of which still affects us to this day, has contributed significantly to underdevelopment. Our foreparents were rooted out and dehumanized, and their blood and sweat and tears and labor were extracted to build empires and beautiful castles and bridges and treasures, which some of us pay money today to visit and photograph and admire. Mr. President, we have been leveraging our collective voice to call for restitution for the historical evil injustices and crimes against humanity committed against our foreparents, crimes which still affect us today. In reaffirming our commitment to this regional campaign, the government of Trinidad and Tobago appointed last year a reconstituted National Committee on Reparations to provide additional energy and support to the CARICOM Reparations Commission and its work with the African Union and other like-minded bodies. And on a related note, we wish to join with those who are committed to and would welcome the proclamation of a second international decade for people of African descent. Mr. President, it is indeed troubling that as we approach the 30th anniversary of the Beijing Platform of Action, women and girls in some parts of this world are still being denied basic human rights and freedoms. And in some quarters, there have been erosions of gains previously made. Trinidad and Tobago continues to be a strong advocate for the meaningful participation of women and girls in all aspects of society, as we recognize and value their critical role in the promotion and protection of human rights and the building of peaceful and sustainable societies. This is important to us, and as we have done biennially since the year 2010, Trinidad and Tobago will table in the first committee this year our resolution on women, disarmament, non-proliferation, and arms control, and we encourage member states to support this forward-looking resolution. Mr. President, the 4th International Conference on Small Island Developing States was held in Antigua earlier this year and underscored the critical nature of the next decade for SIDS. We are very proud of what our fellow CARICOM member state achieved in successfully hosting that impactful conference. Trinidad and Tobago anticipates that the robust implementation of the Antigua and Barbuda agenda for SIDS will bring us closer to sustainable development with the necessary means of support from the international community. Mr. President, we all acknowledge the adverse effects of climate change. We anticipate decisive outcomes regarding the new collective quantified goal at the upcoming COP29 in Baku, Azerbaijan, which should catalyze much-needed reform of the international financial architecture. Effective climate finance mechanisms are essential for the provision of accessible, adequate, and predictable funding, and this requires the operationalization and capitalization of the Loss and Damage Fund. Climate finance goes well beyond project funding. It is an investment in the resilience and sustainability of the most vulnerable nations. The future beckons, a future in which SIDS have the capacity and resources to build infrastructure that can withstand severe climate events. That future would enable a just transition to renewable energy sources and the full protection of our natural ecosystems. Mr. President, like many others, Trinidad and Tobago has long called for the application of new multidimensional parameters for decision-making on access to financing. In this regard, we welcome the recent adoption by the General Assembly of the resolution on the Multidimensional Vulnerability Index. We encourage the international community and the relevant financial and development institutions to utilize the MVI as it takes into account the realities that undermine sustainable development. Mr. President, Trinidad and Tobago stands in full solidarity with the people of Cuba who have been subjected to an unjust embargo for more than 6 decades. This embargo severely undermines Cuba's prospects for attaining economic stability, growth, and sustainable development. Whatever the objectives may have been 60 years ago, these measures have clearly not achieved any desirable results, only the pain and suffering of ordinary Cuban people. The collective punishment of an entire citizenry through unilateral coercive measures is not only unconscionable, but also inconsistent with international law and the Charter of the United Nations. Trinidad and Tobago therefore renews its call for the unconditional lifting of the economic, commercial, and financial embargo against Cuba. Additionally, we have seen no justification for the designation of Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism. We call for the removal of that unjust categorization as well. So, Mr. President, I conclude as I started. This world, our world, is at a point of inflection. With tension and division rising to a crescendo, small states have to be clear-eyed about their future. Trinidad and Tobago is small, but we are proud of that which makes us unique and special. We may not be a superpower, but we have superpowers. And these are our creativity and our diversity. Our cultural milieu is indescribably vibrant as our people are drawn from the first peoples of our hemisphere, as well as the best of India, the best of Africa, the best of China, and yes, the best of Europe too. We are blessed beyond measure. Some of you had a taste of it at the reception when we introduced our president of the last session, and you enjoyed some of our delicacies, including our delicious doubles and bacon shark, and you were delighted by performances on our national musical instrument, the steel pan, and by the magical rhythms of our tassa drums. We have proven that we can be great leaders, including leaders of this very assembly, and we will continue to give more value to this world than we extract from it. We are strong, proud, staunch advocates of the UN system and multilateralism. In the end, unity and togetherness is the key for these United Nations as well as for my own society. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Assalamu alaikum. Shalom alaikum. And may God richly bless you and your families. Mr. President, I thank you.
I thank the Minister for Foreign and CARICOM Affairs of Trinidad and Tobago.
President, we need a reset, and we need to reset. Mr. President, in your absence, I congratulate you on your assumption of this chairmanship of the General Assembly. We can wait. As I said, Mr. President, we need a reset, and we need to reset. Those of us here today representing our brothers and our sisters the world over have endured 4 years of polycrises. As the children of Mother Earth, we continue to wrestle with the climate crisis. As a human family, we grapple with the legacy of the pandemic. As a digitally connected people, we are now, regrettably, confronted by multiple theaters of war and scenes of horror and famine flowing from that war, armed conflict instead of pursued development. Citizens of every country as well, struggling to contain the rising cost of living and the implications for them and their families on a day-to-day basis. And Mr. Speaker, Mr. President, we are all now threatened by the second but silent pandemic of antimicrobial resistance, together with a growing incidence of death and disability from chronic non-communicable diseases. We cannot afford the distraction of war. If ever there was a time to pause and to reset, it is now. Collectively as an international community, and individually as leaders in each of our countries, we must now deliver new opportunities and solutions to these crises which dampen economic growth, which restrict the ambitions of our people and numb our sense of the beauty and goodness that the world ought to be offering because it has it to offer. The reset for which I am calling, and indeed all of our citizens are demanding, must see an end to all forms of discrimination. That rules and institutions today exist which create first and second class citizens, as we have said from this podium year after year, depending on your nation of origin, militate against the trust and the credibility and the hope, and it fosters a crisis of confidence in the existing international order, which must become inclusive and responsive for all. More than any other complaint from this podium has been the disparity in treatment and the inability to be able to have fair and transparent treatment for all that would lead to the trust necessary for us to solve the problems of our times that are truly beyond man-made causes. Neo-colonialist structures that perpetuate and reflect an old world order characterized by racism and classism and misogyny, while ignoring the legitimate aspirations of billions, will not help to foster the hope or trust that is necessary to meet these polycrises. We must ensure that the global institutions give developing countries, especially small vulnerable states like my own, or vulnerable middle-income countries, seats at the table of decision-making where we can be seen, heard, become active agents in our own cause, and lead our own development paradigms. My friends, we are reminded that 2024 is the final year of the United Nations Decade for the People of African Descent. Much has been achieved, but the recognition, the justice, and the development for people of African descent that was promised by this decade has, to say the least, not yet been fully realized. And it is for this reason that the Caribbean community joins the growing chorus, and my own country in particular, for the immediate proclamation of a second decade to complete the unfinished work and address the matter of reparations for slavery and colonialism. I start here because this is a necessary but complex conversation, and the Caribbean community is resolute that it must happen. Its resolution lies, and I want to be very clear, its resolution lies in a multi-generational approach, in the same way that the 20 million pound sterling debt that was incurred by the British government only was repaid in this 21st century, almost 200 years later, so that the notion of unaffordability becomes a non-issue once we recognize that the solution to reparations must be multi-generational and grounded in development. Mr. President, of necessity, the reset must also be characterized by institutional reform, which has to start in the United Nations councils. These councils suggest that some are full members, and others are only part members, and some may be part-time members, and some may be occasional members. All of this has no place in the 21st century. And the anger and the mistrust of our citizens in institutions, in leaders, in multilateralism, and in the processes which exclude while yielding much talk and little action is very real. And nowhere is reform and consequentially trust and hope more important to the well-being of billions of people today than in relation to the global financial architecture. Restricted access to capital, its disproportionately high costs barring us from doing that which we must, its inadequate scale, and the overwhelming burden of debt often imposed on us by circumstances beyond our control. These are all now combining to force governments in the world's poorest countries, and frankly, across many vulnerable middle-income countries, to devote more resources to debt service than to health and education, and in some instances, even infrastructure. For far too many members of the human family, cold ground is our bed and rock is our pillow. Too many go to bed with their bellies hungry, and too many may not even have a bed. Our reset must therefore collectively build a common agenda that reflects and reinforces our shared humanity. It is that shared humanity that binds us together. Mr. President, you know better than most. Our African brothers and sisters got it right with the principle of Ubuntu, and have used this principle, this General Assembly, to remind us that its simplicity is what we should aspire to. I am because you are. I am because we are. My well-being is tied to yours, and our collective well-being is connected to Mother Earth. This best voices the approach needed to give expression to the reset that is absolutely necessary. And we acknowledge that there are glimpses of hope. We have, for example, on Monday, agreed to a pact for the future, but we still have war. We have agreed on a global digital compact, but we still have raging pandemics in the slow motion silent pandemic. All of this rests, my friends, on the common agenda that the Secretary General had set out for us before. Yesterday, we agreed in a high-level meeting on a political declaration on antimicrobial resistance. A lot of fancy words, but this is where the rubber hits the road, because all of us in this room know people who have died from infections and for whom the antibiotics simply are no longer effective, so that within 48 hours, a person's life is snuffed out, almost as if they were at war. My friends, following on the intervention of the Bridgetown Initiative and the Paris Pact for People and Planet, the efforts of many across the board, we acknowledge that there is some hope. And it is evident in the beginnings of the reform that we are seeing little by little, but nevertheless, they have started. These are all important steps, but we cannot take our eyes off the prize. Barbados' call for fundamental reset includes attitudes and behavior as much as actions or reforms. Heads of government are in agree that we must trigger national development agendas of transformation with both speed and scale. We have a date with destiny against 1.5 degrees. We know that that is what is needed to survive. And the implications for people, even as we speak, can be dire. But if there is a failure to act with clarity of purpose, and if the political will retards progress on the front of the much-needed reform within the international financial institutions, purely because heads of government do not speak to ministers of finance when they reach Washington, D.C., or their board directors, if there is a need for that to be dealt with, then, my friends, there must be a commitment to be equal to the current challenges of member states if we are not to perpetuate the discriminatory practices that result in undermining the transformational opportunities that we need. depriving vulnerable countries from being able to access concessional income that is long enough to build the resilience to save lives and to protect livelihoods is unjust. And that is why we must remain focused. That is why, my friends, we launched yesterday the third iteration of the Bridgetown Initiative, which identifies three key principles, very simply. One, we must change the rules of the international financial system and reform its governance and instruments. Two, we must shock-proof vulnerable economies by dealing with debt and liquidity in a comprehensive, development-focused manner. And if we need to give countries a shot of liquidity like we give them a shot of adrenaline to avoid them falling off the cliff of death, then we must do so. And thirdly, we must augment financing by boosting country capacity to invest in resilience by several means, including what has been announced already, the rechanneling of special drawing rights through our multilateral development partners, but that will only be truly effective if there is another issuance of SDRs in the near future. Indeed, we must also address the challenge, and this I believe to be the fundamental mission of this generation, of how we are going to secure the global public commons to be able to maintain our safety and stability as a global community. We're going to have to discuss how we can secure it, and of course, how we must finance it. And that is not only the climate crisis or the loss of biodiversity that we speak about, but the other many global challenges that can truly destabilize countries and regions. Mr. President, these considerations are of fundamental importance to the sustainable existence of our generations, future generations. The SIDS agenda is another story of promises made but not kept. 30 years ago, the international community gathered in my own country to take action for the first time on the unique challenges faced by small island developing states. We birthed in my home country the first ever global agenda for small island developing states, which became known as the Barbados Program of Action. I thank Mauritius for its strategy of implementation, Samoa for its pathway. They were carriers of the baton of a development agenda for small island developing states in the intervening years, in the face of multiple global crises from health to climate to finance. The vulnerabilities, yes, of our countries as small states have become more pronounced. In May of this year, we gathered in Antigua and Barbuda for the 4th International Conference on Small Island Developing States. And I call on the international community and the multilateral system to let us work together to ensure that the promise created in Bridgetown in 1994 is delivered and realized through the Antigua and Barbuda Agenda for SIDS 2024, otherwise known as ABBAS. Let me use this opportunity as well to inform you that 2 days ago we took over the presidency of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, the V20 countries of the world, from Ghana, whose president I would like to thank for the excellent stewardship of the group over the past 2 years, and indeed for the strengthening of its institutional capacity. The priorities of our term as chair of the V20 countries will be the multiple dimensions of climate crisis, dealing with them, the impact of the climate crisis on human health, and of course, the issue of debt and climate, because if we don't solve that, we cannot take the appropriate actions to deal with climate. I invite all United Nations members who are not yet members of the V20 but who are climate vulnerable to join this group, because it is only through amplification of our voices and consistency of our message and solidarity that we will continue to see the pace and scale of reforms that we need to be able to save our people's lives. I commend to you the declaration of the leaders of the Climate Vulnerable Forum that was adopted this week on Wednesday. Mr. President, above all else, we need a global reset on peace. There needs to be global peace. And those of us who are old enough would have recognized that there are peaks and valleys as it relates to this issue of conflict. There are few areas where the world is more in need of the United Nations acting as the United Nations to secure the objectives of the Charter than in the area of peace and security. The silence that has engulfed Sudan is unacceptable and may well be rooted in the racism that the world still carries as a badge of honor from the victories of the last great war of the World War II. The actions in Myanmar cannot continue. Ukraine has sucked more oxygen out of the global community and the global financial system than any of us can appropriately accept at that very time when the world needs to be applying its resources and efforts to fight in the greatest crisis known to mankind. And the spread of the war from Gaza to the consequences in the West Bank to now clearly what is happening in Lebanon as we speak with Israel, all of these are but the tip of an iceberg of death, violence, and instability, and robs the global community of oxygen and resources at the very time when we need it most in a strategic way. We all know, as students of history, that even the longest war in history came to an end. These wars, yes, they too will come to an end. But the question is when and at what cost, and without much loss of life, with how many children not being able to be either given the chance to live or will now live with memories of war that will affect their every action for the next 60, 70, 80 years of their lives. Innocent people are paying the price with the one thing that is theirs to give, and they don't give it willingly. It is their life. Unless we address the root causes of these wars, one by one, and the manners in which they are being sustained and financed, we will never, never know anything else other than war and rumors of war in these theaters. The transmittal of these scenes of horror in real time into people's bedrooms, into people's living rooms, will trigger two extreme reactions, neither of which are acceptable to us in the third decade of the 21st century. We will either get the desensitizing of ordinary people to the loss of lives, especially those of innocent children and women on the one hand, or we will get, on the other hand, the anger and inclination for vengeance that it spawns necessarily. We need peace. And it cannot be too difficult for us to work for peace. It is the same Bible that tells us in the stories of the Old Testament, much which has guided many people across this world. But when we turn from the Old Testament to the New Testament, it is Romans that says to us, "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord," not any country, not any human being, so that the Bible can't be used as a convenient aid when it suits us and rejected when it doesn't. In the midst of this maelstrom, we were very clear. My country took the step this year of recognizing and establishing diplomatic relations with the state of Palestine, in spite of having supported a two-state solution since 1969. And we did this because it is clear to us that the state and people of Palestine, human beings, are entitled to full recognition by integration into and support from the international community. The Charter does not say we the people, with the exception of any one group from any one part of the world. We join with others, therefore, in congratulating the State of Palestine in taking their seat among the United Nations member states as they did on the 10th of September of this year. And let me be clear, we condemn the actions of Hamas on October 7th. But we equally and strongly deplore the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, which is the result of the disproportionate use of force by Israel. There's no justification for it. And that is why treaties exist governing the rules of engagement for war. Because we as human beings learned better and know better and committed to better. A two-state solution, no matter how elusive it may appear to be now, is the only answer. And I've said already this week that we have known difficult battles in mankind's history. But when we were in it, we didn't think we could achieve it. But we did. We abolished slavery. We removed apartheid in South Africa. These battles are not beyond our creativity, our capacity, and our resilience to resolve them. Similarly, we insist that the killing in Ukraine really has to stop. The people of Ukraine must be allowed to live within the internationally recognized boundaries of their state in peace and freedom from the threat of use or force. And as I said, it is sucking too much oxygen out of the global financial system, and countries that should be the beneficiary of aid are being told that they may have to wait in the interest of the defense of others because of war. I say to us truly, there has to be a singular commitment to build a peace. Truly. Mr. President, my own region has not escaped the scourge of instability and violence. The Americas do not constitute today a theater of war. But we are today witnessing, for some years now, an unprecedented escalation in the number and caliber of assault weapons which are finding themselves in the hands of criminals who are wreaking havoc on the legal systems and our societies, particularly in the small island developing states of the Caribbean and indeed in the wider states of Central and Latin America. This scourge caused by guns manufactured in the United States of America primarily also requires a fundamental reset. The right of persons to bear arms in countries not engaged in military conflict should not be an opening to accept as legitimate the presence of assault weapons in countries. It is simply not right. There is no place for assault weapons in our societies. I turn now to the fate of the people of Haiti, which continues to be of major concern to our people in the Caribbean region. The global community now has an opportunity for an essential reset with how it addresses its relationship with Haiti, and which has been born in all kinds of semi and partial concern over the course of the last few decades. We continue to have it as a recurring decimal because we have failed to solve the problems and put them on a sustainable path to development for its people. What is needed is transformation of our sister nation. And yes, we must provide first and foremost security, but transformation must be its handmaiden. The government and people of Haiti need the full support of the international community, not just in the short term, but in the long term. And yes, this starts by extending the mandate of the Multinational Security Support Force, escalating the work of the United Nations, deploying all the tools of bilateral, regional, and global cooperation, not excluding countries who want to participate for spurious reasons, ensuring that those of us who can step up to the plate by significantly increasing the pledge funds that we do so, because we know that it takes cash to be able to deploy the forces and the police necessary to help with the restoration, so that Haitian mother or that Haitian child can go about their day-to-day life without fear of being assaulted or killed or being denied the right to work because of their simple fear of walking the streets. The Caribbean community has been working hard this year to support our largest member state. And in the early part of the first few months of this year, we met on Haiti almost 3 to 4 times a week to guarantee the stability that we ask you now to help us secure. We thank the efforts of the Eminent Persons Group of former CARICOM prime ministers who were on the front line of helping to resolve this complex problem day in and day out so that we could find a political consensus for Haiti. That Haiti had at this General Assembly both the interim president of the Transitional Council and Prime Minister Corneille is a remarkable achievement given where Haiti was in February of this year. Let them continue on a path, please, of securing their future. And we cannot be on this podium speaking about Haiti without thanking Kenya and President Ruto for their remarkable leadership. After many delays and in what represents now a historical precedent for an African country, they have ensured that an African country has taken the lead in helping to tackle the peace and security challenge beyond its own continent. That is the kind of reset that we need in the international community. And Mr. President, you cannot come on this platform regrettably, although I look forward to the day when I will not have to say it, when we must ask for reprieve for the people of Cuba. It is unacceptable, it is unconscionable, and that it continues today is a mark on our international conscience. The Cuban people continue to face the most dire of economic circumstances, and that this is directly as a result of its exclusion and its designation as a state sponsor of terrorism. And I have addressed our only knowledge of terrorism, and Cuba is in fact the downing of the Cubana plane off the waters of Barbados, where Cubans, Guyanese, and Koreans were killed. My friends, Cuba has been a valuable partner stepping up for us when it has mattered most, by the provision of nurses and doctors in pandemics, and by the provision of other essential workers when the global community needed it and when people needed to be liberated in Southern Africa. The reality is that we must have and continue to have resolve in calling for the embargo to be lifted, and we will condemn it year after year after year because it is simply wrong. As we say so, we pray that the people of Cuba, as they determine what damages they have found from Hurricane Helen, as well as we pray for the people of Florida, who clearly are going to spend the next few days identifying the damage as a result of a hurricane that hit Category 4 when it reached Florida. This is the climate crisis that we speak about. The people of Nigeria are still counting the bodies with respect to the floods that took place there. We have hard work to do. In our own Caribbean region, Beryl literally decimated the islands of Carriacou and Union Island, and indeed would have affected Grenada and St. Vincent more broadly. Jamaica and my own country's coastal infrastructure was significantly affected, with our fishing industry, 90% of it being decimated. This season of superlatives, with its floods and droughts, its hurricanes and fires, will take the lives and livelihoods of too many. The climate crisis is hitting us almost weekly across the globe. The deniers of the climate crisis, they too need a reset that will admit of the absolute necessity of collective action by the global community to save our way of life and our planet. Mr. President, at the start of this week, the skies were much darker. I truly believe so. We are starting to see some glimmers of light. We leave New York this week noting that the clouds are lifting, conscious that the sun is peeping out in certain areas, not all, but in certain critical areas, giving us a sense of renewed hope that reset is in fact not only possible, but necessary in key areas: institutional reform, reform in our financial architecture, reform in how we view development, but above all else, reform in how we see each other and value each other. This hope springs from the Pact for the Future and the many declarations that we have made here, the terms in which my fellow leaders spoke from this platform for the most part, the urgent need to recognize reset, 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 even if they didn't call it by that name. It is as if we all truly understand and accept the challenge of rising to solve the major difficulties that are faced by the people of the world, and to recognize that global moral strategic leadership requires of us the commitment to redress the wrongs and to take care of saving people and planet. But recognition of the need for the reset, while it is the first step in any issue, what is now also needed is eternal vigilance as our companion, so that as we take the steps to transform attitudes and institutions and rules, we will not succeed overnight. We will not succeed even in the next decade. But if we don't do the reset to change the legacy of centuries of exploitation and domination, we will not be fit for purpose to meet the needs of our people in the third decade of the 21st century. I can think, therefore, of no better way to conclude than with a song that I had cause to use almost 30 years ago from my own country. Song from Edwin Yearwood when I first stood on this podium almost 30 years ago in 1995 as a young minister of youth. And I quote, "A voice in my head keeps talking to me. It tells me the road is long. It tells me we must be strong. Roll with the pain and roll with the strife, for today is the rest of the start of your life." Mr. President, may the new hope fostered here this week signal the start of a new deal for people who hitherto were not seen, and even with the existence of this body, whose voice and presence were not felt. These people have been recognized too often, and these countries, as mere statistics, and not with the human dignity that is their birthright, or the human dignity that is the conferred right from these United Nations. Mr. President, I thank you.